the government complained that they did not have an official copy of the report that was published. However, for there to be investigations at the national level, the government should have been informed of these allegations and given to reading the events. How is the report commissioned and shared? I believe you're speaking here about the incidents that Ms. Sooka's panel investigated. And the French government did indeed, they were informed by someone who worked for the High Commission for Human Rights through what the High Commissioner himself complained was an informal channel. The French government sent investigators, this is now back in 2015, when they first learned, almost a year ago, through semi-informal channels. They were given a copy of the reports that people from UNICEF and the High Commission for Human Rights had written up after interviewing 6 children. And they were given all the details that Ms. Sooka was referring to earlier, where identification of the victims was quite clear, and it would certainly have been easy enough, in my estimation, for true investigators who really wanted to get to the bottom of the matter to figure out who the perpetrators were, or to certainly hone in on that. And yet, when those investigators said it's one thing to see the written reports of these people from UNICEF and OHCHR, the High Commission for Human Rights, it's another thing for us to be able to talk to those staff members, because they were the first people who spoke to the children personally and interviewed them personally. We're professional criminal investigators. We need to talk to those UN staff. And the UN, to our amazement, claimed immunity from legal process for those staff members and refused to allow the French investigators to speak directly to the staff members from UNICEF and OHCHR who had interviewed the children. And that refusal went on for months and months and months. They would not let their investigators talk to the UN personnel, because they claimed that those personnel were immune from being involved in any part of a legal process. The next question says, if this type of work, investigating instances of sexual abuse, shouldn't be the role of Jane Hall Lute to lead or enact, what do you see her most useful or important role as part of the so-called UN family? And I think the answer to that, again, is clear. The United Nations should certainly have someone who's coordinating the response to victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. There is no question about that, because the UN has created, in this instance, a crisis of its own making, and it needs to go in and clean up the crisis and make sure that, first of all, that all personnel who are working under the banner of the United Nations are trained. It's not realistic or possible to imagine that the UN can take 22, 25-year-old men and suddenly give them a 2-week course in gender sensitivity and turn them into ethical people who would never commit sexual abuse. The training has to entail simply telling the soldiers and the civilian personnel, these are the rules, these are the recommendations. If you commit a crime, this is how you will be investigated, by whom, this is what will happen to you. You will be prosecuted, you will be put on trial, and you will go to jail. And these are the rules and regulations, just as soldiers have rules that say you have to be back in the barracks by a certain time, you have to shine your shoes, you have to carry your gun in a particular way. And just as the civilian personnel know, you have these duties and responsibilities, and if you break the law, then it has to be turned over to the appropriate authorities. That's what the training should entail. We shouldn't pretend that the United Nations, especially since the civilian United Nations staff are committing these crimes as well, we can't pretend that we can put people through a quick training program that will somehow make them more ethical, sensitive people who would never commit these crimes. If such a training really existed in the world, then it would be mandatory in every secondary school across the world, because we'd be able to completely end the scourge of sexual abuse around the world. But such training does not exist. So they should be the United Nations should simply be telling people, these are the rules, these are the regulations, you must follow them. If you don't, these are the consequences, and then ensuring that those consequences are put in place by an impartial body.
Independent structure, that Jane Lute should be doing a number of things. I do think that there has to be a coordination point, and that complaints about sexual abuse should be sent to the central place which her office should be. I think the second is the question of gathering, I think, or putting together a roster of names of experts who do exist both in different parts of the UN, and those people should be available on a standby basis to be immediately deployed in these kinds of situations. These would be professionals at any rate in their own fields, and so there should not be the need to kind of do rapid training. I think they would already have the professional skill to be able to carry out these investigations and also do the forensic work that is necessary, as well as ensure that the evidence is preserved. I do think, like Paula says, that there's a real need to do some oversight of the pre-deployment training, and that this should not be about what you are not supposed to do, but in my view should in fact emphasize the fact that what is happening here is this is criminal, and in some instances may also amount to an international crime, and that there will be repercussions if you are found to have violated somebody's rights in this way. I think there's another element, and this is the question of the vetting and screening and the risk minimization, ensuring in fact that predators, particularly sexual predators, don't make it into either the peacekeeping forces or into the UN civilian staff components. And this means that records need to be kept, databases need to be maintained, and where somebody has been found to have crossed the line, they should be on a list, which means that they can never ever be employed again. I also think that there's a real obligation on the UN to ensure that it's not just about certificates being signed about what has happened in a particular country, but there need to be rigorous checks done of peacekeepers in their own home countries to establish whether or not their names are linked to any kind of sexual offense. Many countries send out people as reward, sometimes to get them out of the way, and often what happens is they repeat in the host country what they have done at home. So in my view, there's a lot of work for this coordination person, and I think that, but it has to be done in a systematic way. There has to be an enormous amount of consultation, I think, with the civil society groups who have been working on the ground, as well as many of the agencies who deal at the coalface with victims. And there's a huge gap over here. I have not seen any signs of anybody trying to ensure that victims are represented in these processes. Often it is left to local NGOs who don't actually have the kind of resources that are necessary to go to another country to ensure that a victim's rights are maintained. So these are some of the gaps which really need attention. But, you know, there's a question of prevention. And the best way of preventing this is to make sure that you maintain the kind of records which will ensure that nobody is employed where there's any possibility that that person may have been linked to a sexual crime in their past manifestations or lives.
This question says 3 blue helmets are now being prosecuted in the Democratic Republic of Congo for alleged violations in the Central African Republic. Is this good news? And why is the Democratic Republic of the Congo able to bring the alleged perpetrators to court, and why is France not yet able to do the same? That's a very good question. The trial that is going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo against soldiers who were accused of sexual abuse in the Central African Republic, and CAR, is certainly a step in the right direction, but it does demonstrate the terrible flaw in the system when soldiers from a particular country are accused of a crime and they're sent home to their country and tried there. The victims are not present, the witnesses are not present. Basically, these soldiers are being put on trial without facing their accusers and without any of the benefit that one would have if you're innocent until proven guilty and you stand before judges with lawyers representing both sides, the victims, the witnesses, because the witnesses and the alleged perpetrators. And then a judge can determine whether or not the preponderance of evidence is weighed against these soldiers. Instead, they're taken out of the country, sent thousands of miles away, and they're sitting in front of a judge who is looking at evidence that was collected and preserved by people with no criminal investigative experience and expertise. The chain of custody hasn't been assured. The appropriate law enforcement officials may have gotten involved very late in the process, and the victims and witnesses are not there at the trial. So yes, it's certainly a good sign that a sign of political will that the DRC is trying people for these crimes, trying soldiers for these crimes, but it does demonstrate, that trial does demonstrate how flawed the process is. And that same process is likely to happen if the French ever do actually indict people for the crimes that their Sangaris forces have committed. The trial will take place in France, and again, the victims of those crimes and the witnesses and the evidence and so forth will not be anything similar to a normal trial that would happen in France against someone who is accused of sexual abuse in that country. It's going to be happening thousands, tens of thousands of miles away, and there's no possibility that true justice and true due process can be served by having these trials so far away from the place where the crimes were committed.
And the UN Secretariat, what it would require is, of course, a change in the status of forces agreement. But if justice is to be seen to be done, then of course it should happen in the country where the violations take place. And I'm sure that the UN could, if it's serious about this issue, insert in an agreement a clause that in fact any kind of trial should take place in the host country so that victims and their representatives are able to attend. At the end of the day, once the matter is handed over to the troop contributing country, that's the last that many victims actually hear about the matter. And for many of them, this is just another futile pursuit with nothing actually happening on any of their cases. If you look at the French case that we investigated, the victims were actually never informed about what the French government was doing, and even today believe that justice has been denied to them. This is a huge issue for the UN, and I think in many countries where you've had peacekeepers, there are these questions of the children born of relationships between peacekeepers and local women. And of course, the UN has had to grapple with the question of paternity. Now, I think that If this was a way of managing the paternity issue, then I'm all for it. But I also wonder if the UN has the capacity to actually manage holding samples of DNA, and it might be more useful if their DNA samples were collected before they arrived in a country, so that if there is a paternity suit, then of course the DNA sample can be matched with that of the child that has been born. This is certainly a novel idea, and I think that if it could work, it should be pursued. But given the administrative nightmares in which much bungling takes place, I would be a little anxious about taking something like that forward. But I think the issue of establishing paternity and ensuring that the peacekeeper or the civilian is responsible for the maintenance of a child is an important issue.
I'd like to say that I agree that it might be a bureaucratic nightmare at the start, but the easiest way to deal with this problem is to, again, put the United Nations Secretariat in the role of model, and they should be saying, do as I do, not just as I say. So it is not a right to work for the United Nations, it's a privilege to work for the United Nations. If you are a non-uniformed civilian who would like to get a job at the United Nations, then you go through a regular medical test. You have to ensure that you have to have a medical test to determine whether or not you have tuberculosis and whether or not you're fit to be traveling around the world and carrying out your jobs as a United Nations international civil servant. At that point, when you take that medical test, if people who want to work for the United Nations, have the privilege of working for the United Nations, were required to submit DNA samples themselves, then in the 50% or roughly 50% of cases of sexual abuse and paternity that arise that have to do with people that are reports made against the civilian personnel, then immediately the United Nations would have on record in the same files where they keep the reports about when you last had your medical exam and whether or not your TB test came back positive or negative, you would have a DNA sample which would be kept confidentially until such time as there was an allegation of sexual abuse, rape, or paternity in a country where you were working as a civilian peacekeeper, and that DNA the DNA of the victim could be, or the baby, could be checked against the DNA of all the civilian UN personnel working in that particular peacekeeping mission. And the UN then wouldn't simply be preaching to the troop contributing countries that they should do a better job with DNA collection. They would actually be showing this is how the system can work. We're doing it for our civilian personnel. We're ensuring that the roughly half of cases that are reported against our staff are immediately traceable through DNA samples. You should do the same.
Most of the reported abuses is in the Central African Republic. I think that in the case of the Central African Republic, of course, it's still very much in a conflict state. And certainly, if you look at the report of the Secretary General, the last one that he put before the General Assembly this year, he in fact blamed the ongoing conflict in the Central African Republic and the fact that sexual violence has very much been a part of the way in which violations have been committed. I'm not sure that that's really a good answer. I do think that the issue of sexual abuse is happening across many if not almost all of the peacekeeping missions. I guess the question is really whether it's happening at the same level. And for me, there's a really big question. Do we actually know exactly what is happening? And don't we actually need the kind of UN-wide inquiry which Code Blue suggested before? Remember that the mandate of the panel was very limited to looking at this incident involving the 6 children. But we were conscious always at all times of the fact that, in fact, the scope of the abuse is so much more wider and so much more complex. And certainly from the figures that came through in the Secretary General's report, the fact that the figures are up from the 2014 period, the fact that almost 55% of it also involves civilians, this suggests that there's a real need to get to grips with the figures. Of course, ongoing conflict probably does facilitate the kind of sexual violence that takes place, but on the other hand, it's impunity and the failure of the UN and member states to address this question, which also facilitates the fact that sexual abuse is ongoing. And that's really the key. What is the international community doing around the fact that there's a real need to prosecute? If you actually look at the figures on prosecutions, they're absolutely dismal. If you look at that in relation to the number of cases that actually exist. And I think that's really where the problem lies.
I completely agree. The problem of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, which is very poorly defined by the United Nations. No one really knows what's permissible and what isn't. But in any case, they say they have zero tolerance for sexual exploitation and abuse. This problem was going on for years and years and years before conflict erupted, this recent conflict erupted in the Central African Republic. The fact that what happened in the Central African Republic with the cases of the 6 boys that were ultimately reviewed by Ms. Sooka and her panel exploded on the international scene. And frankly, the fact that the alleged perpetrators were French, and France is of course a member of the permanent 5 member of the Security Council. It's Western soldiers who were accused of attacking African children and women. That exploded onto the international scene. The international journalists flocked to the Central African Republic. They were doing the job that they've been doing for years and years and years in other peacekeeping operations, although it's quite difficult to expose these cases. Almost all the cases that have been exposed publicly have been brought to light by journalists. Now suddenly, with this very high-profile case in the Central African Republic that the Code Blue campaign revealed a year ago with the 6 boys, which ultimately resulted in Ms. Sooka's panel, suddenly a spotlight was shone on the Central African Republic. But what we know is that the Secretary General has in the past commissioned expert teams to go to the other countries where sexual exploitation and abuse was at crisis levels. And those expert teams come back and they say to the Secretary General, our findings show that the morale of staff and people in the peacekeeping missions is extremely low because there's a culture of silence. No one wants to come forward and report these cases if they suspect that their colleagues and other soldiers are committing them. There's just a sort of desperation among all the peacekeepers. And this is in Haiti, it's in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in case after case around the world, in peacekeeping mission after peacekeeping mission around the world. The Secretary General and the Secretariat have for years known that this is of crisis proportion, and they don't know one tiny fraction of the depth of the depravity and the impunity that's occurring in these peacekeeping missions. But now with the Central African Republic, because all eyes are on that country, it seems as though that's a particular country with a unique problem. It's not the case. It's just if you look hard enough, if you dig deep enough, you will find that these cases of sexual abuse are occurring all over the world, and the victims don't feel as though there's any purpose in coming forward because no justice will be served, and the people who work for the peacekeeping missions don't feel as though their jobs will be safe or as though the system will respond in any way except through the normal institutional channels, which have been determined to be a gross institutional failure. So it's absolutely not a problem of the Central African Republic uniquely. It is a problem across peacekeeping missions worldwide.
To address this question conclusively, I think the first one we spoke about is really the need for the UN and member states not to treat this as a disciplinary matter only, but to recognize that in fact sexual violence is a crime, and that in some instances, depending upon the context, it may rise to the level of an international crime. The second is that there's a real need for an independent structure in which experts are also brought in to support such an independent structure. So one of the things we would like to see, if Jane Lute is that person, that in fact experts such as Paula has spoken about, in terms of those who have the expertise to interview victims, to ensure that the evidence is gathered, that the forensic work is done, and to ensure that victims are not traumatized again. I think this is something that we would like to see. The second, in the case of the Central African Republic, given the fact that in the last few weeks you have seen a number of allegations, including the ones around bestiality, which really should be investigated properly. This is not about the UN sending an in-house team, but really to begin to look at a group of independent experts who can go into CAR and begin to do a system-wide review and investigation of what is actually happening down there and why these cases are so proliferating. I think that's an important issue. I think the third is really for the UN to begin to look at its own policies and its own agreements with member states and troop contributing countries. And that should be about ensuring that investigations take place in a way where the investigation is not carried out by those who have the most interest in seeing that in fact the evidence is suppressed. The question of the conflict of interest. The other is really ensuring that the UN puts in place mechanisms to ensure that victims' rights are protected, that they are not traumatized by being hauled off to face the soldiers who are the perpetrators or the civilians and told to identify the perpetrator. I think that measures should be put in place to ensure that lawyers and legal assistance is provided, and that in fact in a host country where the existing criminal justice system doesn't work, that in fact other mechanisms are put in place to ensure accountability. And above all, if these cases are taken to other jurisdictions, that lawyers are appointed to protect their interests. Most of the victims live in extremely destitute situations. And so the question of damages or reparations in instances when the countries themselves can't provide for that, I think that's a big gap over here. But I think the biggest question is this can't be treated in a piecemeal manner. If you look at the different reports of the Secretary General, the fact that despite the last 30 or 40 years of sexual abuse, we are still waiting for policies and procedures and measures. It's time really to begin to put this matter conclusively to rest. It can't be about what we're going to do in the future, but about what we are doing now. And if we are to avoid the notion of the gross institutional failure that we found, then I think it has to be treated with the kind of serious consideration that it deserves. And that really requires the member states of the United Nations to come to the table. And in fact, whether you're a troop contributing country or a country that is contributing funds, at the end of the day, the protection of civilians should be what guides you at the core of what the UN and EU member states are trying to do. Without that, we are not going to succeed in unraveling the kind of mess we are seeing.
I concur wholeheartedly with what Ms. Sooka just very eloquently and succinctly set out. All those measures absolutely need to be put in place immediately. And I would just stress that the Code Blue campaign is determined to make the point that the topmost level responsible for ensuring the solution of trying to figure out where the problems rest and solving them immediately cannot be the Secretary General of the United Nations. That's where the conflict of interest presides. When the Secretary General, who is responsible for conducting peacekeeping operations, is then also put in charge of being the ultimate person who's responsible for accepting the recommendations and the critiques of expert panels that he commissions himself and determining whether or not he will respond to those recommendations, and if so, to what level, when he's putting people who are the same people who have been mishandling this crisis for decades in charge of now somehow solving it without any protocols, without any guidelines that are overseen by member states. We just have this circular problem where the Secretary General has essentially an entire UN system reporting to him, and he's bringing in experts who also will report to him to try to identify the problems, solve them, and commission experts and staff members to go out into the world, into the peacekeeping missions, and implement these solutions. The Secretary General cannot be all things to all people. He and his staff must continue to protect and support the vulnerable civilian populations in peacekeeping operations, and that whole process needs to be overseen on a 24-hour basis in real time, so that experts who do not report to the Secretary General but report to the member states, report to the Security Council or the General Assembly, and are overseeing the work of the Secretary General as well as of his staff. That sort of oversight board has to be put in place immediately. They have to watch what's happening in real time. They have to report back directly to the Security Council and to the General Assembly, and they have to be people who are expert in victim and in sexual violence, in dealing with victims, but also in military affairs, in law enforcement. And these are top-level officials who will be overseeing everything that happens from the moment a person walks into a police station or a UN mission and says, I was sexually abused by someone who probably works somewhere within the UN system. Then this oversight board, which does not report to the Secretary General but reports directly to the member states, must watch carefully in real time on a minute-by-minute basis every step that the United Nations takes, stop them when they're starting to interfere and intrude in criminal matters where they have no business being involved, and ensure that the member states know right away where the problems are and how they can be fixed, and that there isn't this layer between the crisis and its solution, where top-level officials of the United Nations, the Secretary General and other Undersecretaries General and so forth, are deciding for themselves in secret behind closed doors, how much of this problem are we going to reveal to the public, how much are we going to tell the member states, how will we decide how to respond, will we withhold the information until we're ready, will this look especially bad if we reveal the real numbers, which governments have responded to our requests for investigators and which ones haven't. None of this should be vetted by an internal group of the Secretary General and his senior staff. That should be overseen and in real time and conveyed directly to the member states as these crises are unfolding. And that's how we'll get to the bottom of what exactly are the huge flaws and institutional breakages that cause this crisis to continue. And once we have that in place, it will be a rapid, I believe, a rapid assessment of just what's wrong with this system from top to bottom throughout the world in all peacekeeping missions. And this expert oversight board can tell the member states this is what needs to be fixed. And now with these solutions in place, we can turn it back over to a new Secretary General who, by the way, is about to be appointed at the end of Ban Ki-moon's term. He will be replaced by what we hope will be a female Secretary General. And right now, the member states should be questioning the candidates for that position and asking those candidates, what is your plan for solving this unique crisis that's created by the United Nations and exported to peacekeeping countries around the world, to host countries around the world? What are your specific, tangible measures that you believe must be put in place? And when you're Secretary General, how will you deal with things differently than the way they've been dealt with over the past many decades? Thank you.